Hello everyone. It's Colt. Welcome. Today we're talking about CSS. Specifically, an introduction to CSS. So for complete beginners, people who really have never touched CSS, I'm going to try and go through all the essentials, the very essentials. But it's a pretty large topic, and it's something I'm going to be teaching over the course of at least 6 or 7 different videos. So this is video 1 on CSS. So if you're following along with my Colt's Code Camp course, this is our first CSS video. We've been doing a bunch of HTML. We've made it to a much more exciting section, in my opinion. If you're here just to learn CSS, it will help if you know some basic HTML. So today is a CSS intro. We need to talk about what CSS is, how we actually include it. There are multiple ways. We'll start writing some. We'll learn about element selectors and some properties like color, background, width, height, and there's a bunch more we'll take a look at. But then tomorrow, we're going to focus more on CSS selectors and specificity, the cascade, and then we'll have a video on color, which is surprisingly, it's not complex, but there's a lot of options for color in CSS. We'll talk about the box model, we'll work with text and web fonts and Google Fonts, responsive design and breakpoints, flexbox, animations, transitions, keyframes, lots of topics to talk about. But for now, an introduction to CSS. So CSS is cascading style sheets, that's what it stands for, and I always like to explain it this way using grammar. HTML is the nouns, it's the what, the things on the page, and then CSS is decorating or describing those nouns. So the huge caret is the HTML. CSS could be the huge orange, yellow, I guess 2 colors. The huge orange and yellow would be CSS. The caret is HTML. To put it another way, with HTML, we're describing the basic skeleton, the structure, the content, but not at all what it looks like. So on this easel, we've just got a deer that has not been styled in any way. And on the right-hand easel, we've got HTML. So still, there's a deer there, but now it's full color, there's a background, there's paint splotches, it's larger, I think. Maybe it's not larger. It's different. That is what CSS helps us do. On MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, they describe it as a declarative language that controls how web pages look in the browser. So that's the basic goal of CSS. Here are a couple of examples, this is always kind of fun, of pages that have HTML. We've got the structure, the deer skeleton here, and then I'll put some CSS in, give it a moment, same structure, same elements, same buttons, the same words, but things are completely different looking. We've got a gradient for the background, we've got different fonts that have been included, sizes, borders, box shadows there, if you can see that around here. The buttons have different colors, the inputs are different sizes, the spacing is different, everything is centered. Here's a couple more examples. This is a little bit more radical. So if I get rid of the CSS, I'm scrolling around, by the way. This would be some sort of layout. This is not something I wrote, just kind of a fun demo from CodePen. If I get rid of this CSS here, let's see what we end up with. Okay, well, not a whole lot. We've just got a bunch of little, I think they're SVG elements. They're little smushed circles, and they're all black and white. Here's another one. So CSS is not just about colors and fonts and all of that. It's also what we use to lay out our web pages. So this is a layout that starts out horizontal, as you can see, different columns. And then if I shrink this screen down, they eventually will stack vertically. And if I get rid of that CSS, we will lose the colors, we'll lose that, I don't know if you can see that, there's a transition here where they slowly shrink down. There's a bit of an animation as I resize. So if I get rid of that, all that CSS, goodbye, this is what we end up with. Same content, it's still there, none of those styles. So it's not just colors and fonts and borders and that sort of thing. CSS is what we use to lay a page out. So here's a much more dramatic example. This is a pretty cool grid layout of different shoes, and that's all done with CSS. If I get rid of this, we're just going to have a bunch of images of shoes. This is what we end up with, just a bunch of large images and black and white text. It looks completely different, but the structure is still there. The underlying content, it's just not decorated. So CSS plays a very important role in making attractive, usable web pages. So it's not just about decorating or changing the color, but it's about building interfaces that make sense to other users, at least hopefully, if we know what we're doing. So before we start writing any styles, we need to understand how we actually run them. It's not really running CSS, but it's how we include CSS or include styles in an HTML document. There are three main options, and as you can see here from this slide, two of them are not really recommended, or I don't recommend the first two. But I'm going to show them to you because you should know that they exist and you should know why I don't recommend them. So let's start with this first option, writing styles inline. Okay, so to help explain this, I have a sample document that I'll be working in. You can download this code as well as the completed, I'm doing air quotes because I do need to warn you, our code at the end of this video is not going to be very pretty. We'll be able to style things and select and change colors, but we won't have learned quite enough to make something stunning. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so this is a Wikipedia page, or a slimmed down Wikipedia page on ocelots, a small-ish wild cat. They're pretty cool cats. Anyway, right now, no styles at all. And I'm going to start by showing you inline styles very briefly. If I wanted to change the color of, let's say this H2 right there. Okay, so I am going to do that. I'll find it. It's right here, H2. I can directly write my styles inline in my HTML with this particular element, like this, style equals, and then something like color purple. Now, there's a lot of issues with this approach, but let me just show you that it does actually work. What sucks about this is that often we want to make all H2s or multiple H2s purple, or we might want to style all links the same way on our web page. So if we had to inline color purple or whatever we were doing for every single element, that is a lot of work. And then if you want to change it, it's even more work. And then if you want to share that between different pages of your website, we might have the contact page, we might have the sign up page, sign out. I guess sign out's not usually a page, but a store page, contents, all that stuff. We might want, and we probably want, similar styles. We want all our links to be the same size or the same font, the headings the same color. If we're inlining everything, that is very tricky. It's a lot of duplicated code and just a nightmare to maintain. Okay, so we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to write our CSS separately, not inline, and there are two ways of doing this. The first one is a style element, which is definitely better than writing inline styles, but not as good as an external style sheet. The style element looks like this. We have a style tag, opening and closing. You're supposed to say type equals text/CSS. You can get away without that most of the time, at least. And we need to include this. This part's important. It must be included in the head of the document, although most browsers also will let you ignore that. They assume that you meant to put it in the head. Okay, so we can write this in our HTML document directly in the head, like right here, style. And I can now write CSS styles directly in here. Now, what do we write? What are CSS styles or rules? Well, here is the basic pattern for everything that you do in CSS. We have some selector. We will be focusing a lot on selectors tomorrow, but essentially we have to decide what we are trying to style. Every H1 on the page, the second H1 on the page, well, there should really only be one H1, so that's a bad example. Every link on the page, every other link, the second link, this one link that has a particular name on it, or something called an ID. We have a lot of different things we can select based off of. Then we have curly braces, and in those curly braces, we set our CSS rules, which are a property name, like color, a colon, and then a value, like purple. So here's an example. This will make all H1 elements on the page have a color of purple. Or this will make all image elements on the page have a width of 100 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. So notice this pattern. Something up here, we will be focusing a lot more on that something, a selector, curly braces, and then as many key value pairs, a property name and a property value pair, separated by a colon, and then we have semicolons at the end of each rule declaration here. We call this whole thing a set of rules or a rule set. The terminology doesn't really matter, but we select something, curly braces, do something, set a property, with a corresponding value. Now, there are many, many CSS properties, far more than you'll be able to, well, far more than I'm able to keep in my head at once and remember. A lot of what you end up doing in CSS is mastering the basics and then mastering the art of Googling the stuff that you don't remember or that you may not use all that frequently. There are lots of niche things that can be very useful, but maybe not all the time. But for now, we'll just work with color. So in here, I can set H2, that is my selector. Hopefully this is large enough. Give them a color of purple. So again, same pattern we just saw, but this has to go inside of a style element or in a separate style sheet, which is what we will be preferring, but this is another option. Let's go back to our page and refresh. And you can see now that all H2s, there's only 2 on this page, but they are both purple. So this is already an improvement over doing it inline because I would have had to go to both H2s, this one right here, and this one, where are you? Right there. And I would have had to say style equals color purple. And if I wanted to change them, I wanted to make both of them teal, I would have to change it here, and I would have to change it on every other H2. If I had 100 H2s on this page, that's a lot of changes. With this CSS syntax where I select some element type, all H2s do this. It's much easier. I can make them all purple all at once. Now, of course, there are lots of styles that you may want to add to your page, but not to every single element, not to every H2 or every image. There are lots of different ways of getting more specific and nuanced in what you are selecting. But we're just at the intro section. This is our first CSS video, so we're focusing on element selectors. We select by element name. Now, this is better. A style element is better than what we were doing by inlining styles, but it still is not great because if I wanted to have a second page, a jaguar.html page, or a lion or tiger, or a sand cat, I mean, look at how adorable those guys are, or a palace cat, also very adorable wild cat. Anyway, oh, that's very cute. If I wanted to have another page with the same styles, I want all H2s to be purple, and maybe I've set, 20 or 30 different things, or maybe thousands of different CSS properties. If I wanted to share that with a style element, I would have to copy this entire thing and duplicate it in every other page, every HTML page for each of those other cats. And then I would have to try and keep them in sync. If I needed to change one of them, I decided, instead of purple, we have a different shade of purple or a new custom brand color or whatever it is. I would need to update every HTML page, which is why style tags or style elements are okay, but they're not as good as a completely separate external style sheet. What that means is writing our CSS code in a CSS file, and we can require or include that CSS document in any other HTML page that we may want to use it in. So I can have one style sheet, I can write my styles in one place, and then apply or use those styles on 100 different HTML documents if I wanted to. So I'm going to delete this, and instead, we are going to write a CSS file. To write a CSS file, just make a new file. I'm going to do it in the same folder as my ocelot.html, and I'm going to give it some name that ends in .css. So we have .html for an HTML file, .css for a CSS file. So I like to just go with app.css or styles.css or main. Eventually you may have larger apps where you may not just have a single style sheet. You might have forms.css and button.css. But for now, let's just go with app.css. Here's my CSS file. It's empty. And I'm going to add in another rule, very similar to what we just did. All H2s, I'll give them a different color this time. How about orange? We'll be able to see that. I'll save this file, and I have to include it. If I don't include it, we're not going to see any of that stuff. None of that code, none of that CSS, which is just one property, making these guys purple, or orange rather. That won't work until I include my app.css file in this ocelot.html file. To do that, we use a special element called a link element. Usually I just do this in VS Code. I'll type link and hit tab. This needs to go in the head The head is all the meta information, any resources like style sheets or fonts that we're including, basically the stuff that does not show up as content. So a style sheet is a perfect example of that. We want it here, it's important, but the style sheet itself is not content that shows up. It is the adjectives that describes our content. So we need to set a link element, a rel attribute set to style sheet. You can get away without this. A lot of the time the browser will figure out what you're trying to do, but to be totally correct, it should be there. And then we have href, which needs to be the path to access our file. So in our case, it's app.css. We're in the same directory. If I had a styles folder and I had app.css in there, I would need to make sure to reference the full path to get there from this file, ocelot.html. All right, so we have that in there. I'm going to refresh my page, and it is working. I'm now getting orange on etymology and taxonomy, my two H2s. So now we have one style sheet, app.css. Whatever I write in here, I can include in any other HTML document, and those styles will be applied across all those documents. All right, so now we've seen 3 different ways of writing styles. Definitely recommend number 3 here. And really, the second option is way, way better than option 1. So 2 and 3 are the better choices, but I would almost always write styles externally in a standalone style sheet. I wouldn't use a style element, except if you're just trying to test something out very quickly and you don't want to have to make a new file. Okay, so we've talked about this basic pattern that we use all the time in CSS. We have some selector, which right now we've really just been selecting things based off of the element type. We will see other selectors, but let's focus on the property portion. So inside those curly braces, we have different properties that we can set, like color. We've already seen at least 1 or 2 colors, purple and orange. We also have things like width and height. We even have fancier things like setting a border. In this case, the selector I'm using, this is not something that we're going to learn today, but you can probably figure out how it works by looking at it. We are selecting all inputs that have a type set to text attribute, and we're not selecting every single one. We are targeting every other, so every second one. And we give them a red border that is 2 pixels wide and a solid line instead of dashed or dotted. So we'll see more selectors. We'll learn about how these all work. For now, we're doing things like image or H1. I just wanted to show you that we can get fancier. But we're going to start with these different properties: border, width, height, color. There's a whole reference on MDN called CSS reference that is going to show you all of the properties you have access to. There are tons of them. A couple of these things actually aren't properties here. Some of these are things like different selectors. They're called pseudo selectors, if you see those colons there. But for the most part, there are a couple hundred properties in CSS that we can set. Things like opacity. What else do we have? And color is in here. We have text align, text indent, font size, caret color, margin. These are all things that we'll cover eventually. I want to start with just a couple. Let's go with color, and we'll also talk about background. So background is somewhere on here. I'll also pull up border. Background right there. Specifically, I want to focus on background color. So background color allows us to set a color for the background of some elements. It looks like this, background dash color. And for now, we're only going to stick with these named colors. I'm going to do a separate video on color systems in CSS. As you can see, there's quite a few different options just to set the background color. So we're going to focus on named colors, of which there are quite a few in CSS. Here's a reference. These are all built-in colors that we can use. We reference them by name. Antique white, aquamarine, bisque, blanched almond. There's quite a few of them as I scroll down. These are not typically used in a real application because most companies, most websites have their own color scheme with their own custom shades and hues of colors, not just, what is this, 200 or so. We're not limited to these specific colors, but in this video, we are going to stick with them. So let's pick one. How about Dodger blue? Actually, let me pick a lighter one, a background color. Is there like a light pink? Maybe this. Oh, it's called light pink. Okay, so we're going to give what should we do? Maybe just the entire body. We'll give it a light pink background color. So let's try that. I can select body, Technically, this would select all bodies on the page, but there's only one body in a valid HTML document. Background dash color, and then I'll do light pink. You can see VS Code is auto-completing that for me. Let's refresh. And there we go. I've got a light pink background. We can also do things like let's select this H1 and give it a background color. So H1, this would apply to all H1s. Background color. Let's go with, sure, aqua. Let's see how that looks. We're not going for attractiveness at this point. And you'll see that the background goes all the way across. So an H1 is a block level element, which means that it takes up an entire block. It pushes everything off onto the next line. It needs to live on its very own line, at least by default. I'll show you that you can actually change that. Anyway, there's a background color. I can do multiple properties. I could give it a text color, which is just color. If we do that, light, aqua color, maybe, I don't know, this is going to be hideous. Let's go with magenta. Let's see how that looks. We do need a semicolon here. VS Code is actually going to put that in there if I leave it off. At least sometimes it will. Notice here, if I don't have a semicolon right there, it gets mad at me. It gives me this underline here saying, what's it say? Semicolon expected. So we need to have a semicolon after every property that we set. Even if it's just one inside of this block between the curly braces, we still need to have that in there. Don't rely on VS Code to add it in for you. I'm saving and it adds it in, but it won't always get it right. So there we go. We now have a background color for the H1 and a text color. We can style all of the links. Why don't we do that? So the links are anchor tags. And I'm going to give them all, I don't know, what should we do? A color of white. Is that going to be too light? And it's kind of hard to read, isn't it? Maybe we'll also make them a larger font size. So I'm just kind of throwing out properties. We are going to have a designated video to talk about fonts and text, but there's a property called font size. Now, the reason we're going to have a designated video is that there are many different units we can use. I'm going to stick with pixels. So I'm going to give that a font size, every link, maybe 30 pixels. That should make it significantly larger. So you can see our text here, the paragraph is whatever the default font size is. I didn't touch it. And our links are now 30 pixels, which happens to be larger. Yes, not very attractive, but it works. Next up, we'll see another property called border. This is something we'll also come back in a separate video when we talk about the box model. But for now, I'll show you how to set a border with a color on any element that you want. Let's do a border around any UL on this page. So an unordered list, we'll add a border. So there's 3 of them. And that would be a UL that we're selecting. Whoops. The name of the element, all ULs. And I could start with a background color just so you can identify where they are. Let's go with a black background color. Refresh my page. So we've got a UL there, we've got a UL there, and we've got a UL there. And maybe instead of a UL, I think I have a header element in here. Right there, I've got a footer element. So why don't I do this for the footer element? I'll give this footer element a border. So I'm going to change that to be footer, just any CSS or any HTML element. And then instead of a background color, I'm going to give it a black border to start. And the way that border works, at least the option I'm showing you, is that there are 3 pieces we have to specify. First of all is the width of the border. So I'll do 3 pixels. Then we have the style of the border. Is it a solid line? And we'll start with solid. And then the color. And we'll go with black to start. So those 3 things in that order. We'll save, refresh the page, and now my footer has a border around it, as you can see. So we can change that. We could do, I don't know, how about 10 pixels? Refresh the page. It's a lot thicker. I can do I can never remember these. If it's dashed, yeah, there's dashed. I think there's dotted. It's not the most attractive. Well, none of this is, so I'm going to go back to solid. And then you could change the color to be whatever you want. Let's do teal. Okay. So that is the very basics of border. Next up, we'll talk about width and height. So in this folder, I have an image, kitty under bed.jpg. I'll add that image in. Where should I do that? Maybe after the h1, I'll add an image tag, set it to have a source of kitty under bed.jpg. Let's take a look. There's my cat under the bed. All right, so I want to set the width of this image. It's a little bit large, or the height. And there's a property for that. So I'm going to select all images and set a height. Let's go with 100 pixels and see what that does for us. Okay, it's pretty small. You can see also that the image does shrink down appropriately, so it scales down. I'm not just squashing the height and then leaving the width as the original width. Let's go to maybe 300 pixels. How does that work? Yeah, that's a little better. I could also set the width, if I wanted to be, how about 800 pixels? Let's see what happens there. Now it is squashing things. When I set an explicit height and a width, it is going to follow those instructions. So whatever the proportions of this image were originally, I can't remember if it's, I don't think it was square. I'll comment this out, which, by the way, these are comments in CSS. We've got our slash and a star, and then a star followed by a slash. I just used the shortcut in VS Code, command slash, toggling it on and off. So if we go back, yeah, it wasn't quite a square. Whatever that ratio is will be preserved if I'm setting the height or if I'm setting the width. It will stay that same proportion, but as soon as I set both of them, the browser will follow whatever I tell it to do here. So I could make this, 100 pixels tall and get a very squashed kitty, but I'm not going to do that. We'll go back to probably just 300 pixels there. And why don't we also add a border? Let's do a 3 pixel solid. Is black going to look good? Well, nothing's going to look good, but let's see. Yeah, that looks okay. So there's our border. Maybe just for variety's sake, I'll do a dashed border. Okay, so now we've seen a couple different properties, right? We've seen color, background color, height, width, font size, border. I'm going to show one more, which is called display. Display is a special property. I'll go pull it up here on the reference. See if I can find it alphabetically, or just search for it. Display. Right there. Display allows us to decide or define whether an element is treated as a block or inline element. Now there are quite a few options for the value that we set with display. We're not going to worry about most of them. I'm just going to show you what happens if we set this H1 here, all H1s, to have a display of inline. So right now, an H1 by default is a block level element, but now that I've set it to be an inline element and I refresh, pretty drastic change. It no longer takes up its own line. You can see that H1 there. And this image is also an inline element. And we end up with our image and this ocelot H1 sharing the space. Down here we have a paragraph, which is a block level element. Let me just verify that that's what we've got going on. Yes, so if I made all paragraph tags display inline, you'll see that we end up with all of our text like that. Multiple paragraphs here are no longer on their own lines. They just smush together. And now we've got ocelot, H1, our image, and then text from the paragraphs all together in line. The other version that we can do, the other thing I'll show you now, is that we can take something like an anchor tag, which is an inline element. It does not take up its own block, as we can see. And I can set that to be display block. Not black, but block. And now every single anchor tag takes up its own line all the way across the page. Not something we probably want to do, but we can. And then one other option I'll show you is display none, which will hide all anchor tags at this point. So they're not displaying, so we don't see them. So I'm going to undo that anyway. Probably comment that out so you have a reference if you want to look at this code. And there's a lot more to this display property, but I think that's all we'll do for now. And that's a pretty basic overview of the flow of CSS. You select something. So far, we've always been selecting just an element name, but there's a lot more to do and to cover, which we'll do tomorrow. And then inside of these curly braces, we specify properties with a corresponding value. So a property name, colon, value. color, orange, background color, light pink, font size, border, height, width, display. Of course, there are hundreds of properties. It gets a little bit overwhelming if you try and memorize them all. You will learn the important ones and the ones that you commonly use just by using them enough. The more rare ones, you just Google. That's what all of us do. Unless I'm sure there are some CSS experts who have everything memorized, but most developers are going to Google a lot and find inspiration and figure out, how do I set this one property, or what is the syntax for a box shadow, or what's the syntax to set a gradient, a radial gradient. I can never remember that stuff. I just look it up. But the basics, font size, color, background color, display, width, height, and quite a few more properties you'll use frequently enough that you'll just learn them through use. If you're interested, I've got a little bit of a homework assignment, exercise, a do this at home to get more practice activity, and it looks like this. There's a folder in the download in the description for this video if you download that one file. Unzip it, there's a homework folder, and inside there's an index.html, which when you open it up will look just like this. There are no styles. Then there is a main.css, and it is empty except for a bunch of comments, but it's not doing anything. It's also not even included in the HTML file. So there are steps I'd like you to go through. The first one is including the CSS file, main.css, in index.html. And then there are different styles I'd like for you to write. So I've given you the colors if you need to use colors, the actual color names here. You could also just change them to be whatever colors you want. But just to show you what it would look like, it's still going to be hideous, but this is the end result. So if we step through some of this, give the body a background of light steel blue and a steel blue border. So light steel blue, and that is regular steel blue. I tell you how wide to make it. Then we've got make all the H2s dark blue, make all I elements light yellow and 40 pixels, make all superscript elements orange, red, and 20 pixels. So you can see this is what it starts as. Here, that's what it ends up as. Give the H1 a background of aquamarine and make it an inline element. So you can see it's inline here. Give the ordered list a 2 pixel wide orange, red, dashed border. That's right there. Make the image 300 pixels wide and make it take up a whole line of space. So notice how the image is behaving here. We've got this span afterwards. They're sharing a line. Now they're not. And then make the horizontal rule. Oh, I totally screwed that up. There we go. Disappear using CSS. So there is a horizontal rule in HR. I'd like you to make that go away. It's not here anymore. But don't delete it from the HTML. Don't touch the HTML except to include main.css. And then here's a bonus, something we have not talked about. You'll have to do some research if you're new to CSS. Make all li elements uppercase text through CSS. Don't touch the actual li's over here. It looks like this. It's all caps. It looks like we kept the caps lock key on. The HTML is not in caps. I mean, there are some capitalized letters, but this is all done through CSS. You'll need to Google how to do that if you don't know. Okay, so very basic intro to CSS. We have seen how to connect a CSS file using a link element. We've seen the basic syntax where we type something, a selector, our curly braces, and then various properties with a colon separating the property name and value, semicolon after each pair. We can have multiple pairs, and that's it for now. Like I've mentioned a couple times, we have a ton more to cover. We've got selectors and specificity. We need to talk about why CSS is called cascading style sheets. We need to talk about all sorts of color stuff and hexadecimal colors, RGB colors, the alpha channel, HSL colors, and gradients. We need to talk about the box model and margin and padding and border. We need to talk about styling text and web fonts and including icons and Google Fonts, responsive design and breakpoints, Flexbox for layout, animations, lots and lots of stuff coming up. This is just an intro. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. Thanks for watching. Hope everyone's doing well, staying safe, and staying sane. I'll see you tomorrow.